top 5 Stephen King-inspired horror stories. Which one gave you the biggest chills? Or do you have a spine-tingling idea that could rival these? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your scary story ideas. If this video gave you goosebumps, make sure to smash that like button and hit subscribe for more terrifying tales. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell. You won't want to miss the nightmares we have coming your way. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the scariest stories aren't just fiction. Stay curious, stay bold, and as always, sleep with the lights on.
The Night Train. Evan Grayson had never been one to believe in ghosts. He barely believed in second chances. So when he stumbled into that shabby little train station on the outskirts of town, rain slicking his coat to his skin, he thought nothing of the strange name scrawled above the ticket booth, Terminal Number 13. It sounded like something out of a dime store horror novel, but to Evan, it was just a refuge from the storm. The station smelled of damp wood and mildew. The benches were empty, save for a woman in a tattered red coat who sat hunched over, her face obscured by a curtain of hair. She didn't glance up as Evan entered, though he thought he heard a faint humming coming from her direction. Something about her seemed off, but he was too tired to care. A clock on the wall ticked loudly, though its hands didn't move. Evan approached the ticket window, where an old man sat behind the glass. His eyes were cloudy, and his skin had the pallor of candle wax. "Where's this train going?" Evan asked, slapping a $20 bill onto the counter. The old man smiled, revealing teeth too sharp for his withered face. "Anywhere you need to go," he said. "But it's not about where, son. It's about why." Evan blinked. "What the hell's that supposed to mean?" "You'll figure it out." The man pushed a paper ticket under the glass, the ink smudged and wet. It read simply, "The Night Train. Boarding now." Evan turned back to the platform. Through the sheets of rain, he saw a single train car pulled up to the station. Its windows glowed faintly, though the light didn't seem to reach the tracks below. He stepped outside, the ticket clutched in his hand, and climbed aboard. Inside, the train was wrong. It looked ordinary at first, rows of burgundy seats, overhead lights flickering softly. But the air was thick, heavy, like the inside of a grave. And the passengers? They were a gallery of the lost. A man in a blood-stained tuxedo staring blankly out the window, a little girl clutching a headless doll, an elderly couple holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white. Evan slid into an empty seat and tried to shake the unease crawling up his spine. The train lurched forward, moving faster than any locomotive had a right to. The rain outside turned to streaks of light, then darkness. He looked across the aisle and met the hollow gaze of a boy no older than 10. The boy's mouth moved, but no sound came out. "What?" Evan leaned closer. "You shouldn't be here," the boy whispered, his voice faint and brittle, like leaves crushed underfoot. "Yeah, well, tell that to the guy at the ticket counter," Evan muttered. "Said this train goes wherever I need to be." The boy's eyes widened. "That's what it wants you to think." Before Evan could ask what the hell that meant, the train shuddered to a stop. The doors hissed open, and a rush of cold air flooded the car. Outside, the platform was blanketed in mist, shapes moving in its depths. One by one, the passengers began to rise. The man in the tuxedo, the little girl, the elderly couple. They shuffled toward the doors, their steps slow and deliberate, as though walking through molasses. "What are they doing?" Evan asked, but the boy didn't answer. He was staring at the fog, tears streaming silently down his face. Evan stood and followed the others to the door. He didn't step off though, he just watched as they vanished into the mist. The air outside buzzed with a low electric hum, like a distant swarm of bees. He could hear whispers too, just out of reach, tugging at the edges of his mind. "They're not coming back," the boy said softly from behind him. Evan turned. "Why not?" "Because they found what they needed." The train doors hissed shut. and with a jolt, they were moving again. This time, the darkness outside the windows was absolute. Evan sat back down, his hands trembling. "What is this place?" he asked, but the boy just shook his head. Stop after stop, the train emptied. At each station, more passengers disembarked, disappearing into the unknown. By the time they reached the 9th stop, it was just Evan and the boy left. "I'm not supposed to be here," Evan said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm not. I was just trying to get out of the rain, that's all. I don't need whatever this is." The boy looked at him, his eyes ancient and weary. "Everyone who gets on this train needs something. You'll figure it out." The train slowed one last time, and the boy stood. "This is your stop." Evan shook his head. No, I'm staying. I don't even know what—" "It doesn't matter if you're ready," the boy said, his voice firm. "The train decides." The doors opened, and this time there was no mist, just a yawning black void that seemed to stretch forever. Evan's heart thundered in his chest as an unseen force pulled him to his feet, dragging him toward the exit. "Wait!" he cried, but the boy was already gone, his seat empty. Evan stepped off the train, and the door's walls like greedy fingers. No, it was the stories that kept people away. Stories of screams in the night, of faces appearing in the windows when no one lived there. But Harper Davis didn't believe in stories. She believed in deadlines, in paychecks, in the long-shot hope that her first novel might actually sell. That's why she rented the place. A month in Blackthorn Hall, isolated from the distractions of the city, was supposed to be her solution. A little peace and quiet, and maybe some inspiration from the house's dark history. The first night she thought the creaks and groans of the old house were normal. It was over 100 years old after all. Wood settles, pipes rattle. She ignored the faint scratching sounds coming from behind the walls, blaming mice. She unpacked her laptop, brewed a cup of instant coffee, and got to work. But by the 3rd night, the noises had changed. The scratches were louder, more insistent. She swore she heard whispering just below the edge of hearing. Harper paused her typing and strained to listen, but the sounds would stop as soon as she focused on them. She chalked it up to her imagination. Too many hours reading horror novels, too much caffeine, too little sleep. Until the door to her room slammed shut. Harper yelped, nearly spilling her coffee. She rushed to the door, her heart pounding, and yanked it open. The hallway was empty, the windows were closed. No breeze, no one else in the house. She laughed nervously and muttered to herself, "Get a grip, Harper." But the house had other plans. By the end of the first week, Harper's nerves were frayed. The whispers were louder now, unmistakable. They came from the walls, the floor, even the air itself. Sometimes they sounded like her own voice, repeating her worst doubts and fears. "You'll never finish this book. No one will read it. You're wasting your time." She tried blasting music through her headphones, but the whispers seeped through. She left lights on in every room, but shadows danced at the edges of her vision. She thought about leaving, but no, she couldn't go back to Braxton a failure. Besides, she told herself, she didn't believe in ghosts. That changed on the 10th night. Harper woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow, heavy, too deliberate to be the creaks of an old house. She sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest, her heart hammering in her ears. The footsteps stopped outside her bedroom door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer, just the faint sound of breathing, shallow, wet. Harper grabbed the nearest thing she could find, an empty wine bottle from the nightstand, and crept toward the door. She reached out with a shaking hand and turned the knob. The door swung open, revealing an empty hallway. But the air was freezing, her breath visible in the dim light. And on the floor, leading away from her door, were muddy footprints. Barefoot. Human. The next morning, Harper tried to call her landlord, but the phone line was dead. Her cell had no signal. She thought about walking back to town, but the forest seemed wrong. The trees loomed taller, their branches twisted unnaturally. The path she'd taken to the house was gone, swallowed by undergrowth. She was trapped. That night, the whispers grew louder. They spoke of the others who had lived in Blackthorn Hall, a painter who'd gone mad and cut off his own ears, a family who'd vanished without a trace, a writer who'd, you'll be next. Harper screamed and threw her laptop across the room. It hit the wall and shattered, but the whispers only laughed. She fled to the living room, where a fire burned low in the hearth. The flames cast flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own. "What do you want from me?" she cried. The whispers answered, "Stay." By the end of the month, Harper's manuscript was finished. She had written feverishly, possessed by a force she couldn't explain. The words poured out of her like blood from an open wound, dark and raw and terrifying. She didn't remember sleeping, eating, or even thinking. When she typed the final sentence, the whispers stopped. The house was silent. She packed her things and left without looking back. The forest path had returned, as though the house was letting her go. In town, she mailed the manuscript to her agent and tried to forget about Blackthorn Hall. The book became an instant bestseller. Critics called it a masterpiece of modern horror, its descriptions so vivid they felt real. Shadows on Main Street. The town of Harpers Hollow was the kind of place people passed through on their way to somewhere else. Once, it had been bustling. Kids on bikes zigzagging across Main Street, the diner's neon sign buzzing against the twilight, and the general store's bell jingling as neighbours greeted one another. But that was before the shadows came. No one could say exactly when it started. At first, it was just small things. A chill in the air on a sunny day, lights flickering for no reason, a feeling of being watched when no one was there. Then, the disappearances began. First, old man Willard, who everyone figured had wandered off into the woods in one of his senile fits. Then the O'Malley twins, whose bikes were found lying on their sides near the old train tracks, wheels still spinning. By the time Clara Hensley vanished from behind the counter of her bakery, leaving a half-frosted cake and a tipped-over piping bag, people knew something was wrong. Main Street emptied out after that. Shops closed, curtains stayed drawn. Those who could leave packed up their cars and drove away without looking back. Those who stayed, well, they learned to live with the shadows. Lila Harper was one of the ones who stayed. She had no choice. Her father's health had been failing for years, and she couldn't abandon him. Not that he noticed much these days. He spent his days in his recliner, staring blankly at the muted television, a thin blanket draped over his knees. "You've got to eat something, Dad," Lila said, setting a bowl of soup on the side table. He didn't respond. He hadn't said much since Mum had disappeared 6 months ago. Lila didn't blame him. She still woke up at night, hearing her mother's voice calling her name from somewhere outside. But when she got to the window, there was never anyone there. Just the long, dark stretch of Main Street, empty and silent. That night, as she washed dishes in the kitchen, Lila felt it again. The weight of unseen eyes pressing against her back. She turned, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but the house was quiet, her father snoring softly in the living room. Still, the feeling didn't go away. It never did. The shadows didn't like the light. That much everyone had figured out. Streetlights had been left on day and night, their amber glow buzzing faintly even at high noon. But the shadows were clever. They found the weak spots, the corners of alleys, the spaces under doors, the slivers of darkness where the light couldn't reach. Lila's best friend, Caleb, worked at the gas station on the edge of town. He'd rigged up a dozen floodlights around the place, turning the forecourt into a glowing island in the sea of night. "We should just leave," Caleb said one evening as they sat on the hood of his truck. "You and your dad could come with me, start fresh somewhere else." Lila shook her head. "You've seen what happens when people try to leave." Caleb didn't argue. Everyone had heard the stories, cars breaking down on the outskirts of town, shadows slipping in through the cracks. The bodies, when they were found, were always pale and cold, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. It happened on a Tuesday. The shadows came for Caleb. Lila had been on her way to the gas station when she saw the lights go out. One by one, the floodlights around the station blinked off, plunging the forecourt into darkness. She slammed on her brakes, her heart hammering. "Caleb!" she screamed, throwing open the car door. The shadows were already moving, a writhing mass of darkness spilling out from the station's windows and doors. They were alive, coiling and twisting like smoke, reaching for anything. Anyone. Lila grabbed the flashlight from her glove compartment and sprinted toward the building. She shone the beam into the darkness, and the shadows hissed, recoiling like snakes. But there were too many of them. She heard Caleb's voice, faint and desperate, calling her name from somewhere inside. Then, silence. When the floodlights flickered back on, Caleb was gone. All that was left was his truck, the driver's door hanging open. Lila couldn't sleep that night. The shadows were growing bolder, stronger. She sat in the living room, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. Her father snored softly in his chair, oblivious to the danger creeping closer with every passing hour. It was past midnight when she heard the scratching at the door. Not the gentle scrape of tree branches or the wind, but deliberate, insistent. She stood, her heart pounding, and pointed the flashlight at the door. The scratching stopped. Then the whispers began. They were faint at first, just a murmur, like wind through the trees. But they grew louder, clearer, until she could make out the words. "Lila, let us in." She backed away, the beam of the flashlight shaking in her trembling hands. The shadows seeped through the cracks around the doorframe, curling along the walls like ink spilled in water. "You can't have me," she whispered, her voice shaking. The shadows laughed, a sound that was cold and hollow. "Not yet." The flashlight flickered, its beam dimming. Lila scrambled to replace the batteries, but by the time she turned it back on, the shadows were gone. The room was empty, silent, except for the faint hum of the streetlights outside. The next morning, she packed a bag. She didn't know where she would go, only that she couldn't stay. As she stepped out onto Main Street, she felt the eyes of the shadows watching her from every corner, every alley. The town was theirs now, and she knew they wouldn't stop until there was no one left. As she drove toward the edge of town, the shadows followed, creeping along the edges of the road, waiting for the light to fail. And Lila prayed it wouldn't. The organ grinder. There was something about the organ that made people stop and stare, not just because it was rare to see an old-fashioned street organ in the age of Spotify and Bluetooth speakers, but because of the music itself. It wasn't cheerful, like a carnival tune, nor haunting like something from a funeral dirge. It was somewhere in between, strange, hypnotic, the kind of melody that lodged itself in your head and refused to leave. The man who played it was just as odd. Tall and thin, with a threadbare coat and a battered top hat, he appeared on street corners seemingly at random. He would crank the organ handle slowly, methodically, his gloved hands never faltering. His face was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes didn't belong to someone who smiled, though his lips were often curled into a small, inscrutable grin. The first time Emily saw him, she was on her way home from work. The air was crisp, the kind of late autumn chill that promised winter wasn't far behind. She'd just rounded the corner onto Ashford Avenue when the music stopped her in her tracks. She turned, spotting him near the entrance of a narrow alley. The organ was a thing of beauty, its wood carved with intricate patterns of roses and vines. It looked old, older than the man playing it, older than the city itself. The crowd that had gathered around him seemed entranced, their eyes glazed over, their heads slightly tilted as if listening to a voice only they could hear. Emily felt an odd pull toward the music, a tug at something deep inside her. But the longer she listened, the more uneasy she became. There was an edge to the melody, a sharpness that made her skin crawl. She shook her head, snapping herself out of the trance, and hurried home. By the time she got to her apartment, the music was still in her ears. She couldn't shake it. It lingered as she made dinner, as she watched TV, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling. It wasn't just in her ears, it was in her chest, her bones, vibrating through her like a second heartbeat. The next morning, she found herself walking the same route, half hoping and half dreading she'd see him again. She did. He was in the same spot, playing the same tune. But this time, something was different. The crowd was smaller, their faces paler. One woman swayed on her feet as if drunk, while a man wiped at his nose, leaving a streak of red on his sleeve. Emily felt the pull again, stronger this time. She took a step forward, then another, her feet moving of their own accord. The music wrapped around her like a net, tightening with every step. "Miss," a voice cut through the fog. Emily blinked and turned to see a young man in a delivery uniform holding out a package. "You dropped this," he said, handing her a scarf she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. The moment was broken. The music faded to the background, and she stumbled away, muttering a quick thanks. But as she glanced back, she caught the organ grinder's eyes on her. He tipped his hat, and for a moment she thought she saw something flicker in his expression. Satisfaction, maybe, or hunger. Over the next few days, Emily couldn't escape the organ grinder. He appeared everywhere, near her office, outside the grocery store, even on the corner by her gym. The tune was always the same, and so was the effect. People gathered, drawn in like moths to a flame, their faces slack, their movements sluggish. Emily started noticing other things too. The people who lingered too long near the organ grinder began to change. Mrs. Hensley from the bakery down the street stopped coming to work. Emily saw her once, standing in her window, staring out with blank eyes, her hands trembling. A man she recognized from her building was found unconscious in the alley, his face gaunt, his skin cold. And then there were the dreams. They started the night after she first saw him. In them, she stood in an endless black void, the organ grinder's music echoing all around her. She couldn't see him, but she could feel him, his presence looming just out of sight. The music grew louder, sharper, until it was all she could hear. When she woke, the sound lingered in her ears, as if she'd never truly left the dream. Emily decided she needed answers. She started asking around, trying to find out who the man was, where he came from. But no one seemed to know. He had no name, no history. One old woman claimed he'd been in the city when she was a child, playing the same organ, wearing the same clothes. "He's a curse," the woman whispered, clutching her rosary. "That music of his takes something from you, leaves you empty." By the time Emily got home that night, she was shaking. She locked the door, pulled the curtains tight, and turned on every light in the apartment. But it didn't help. The music was still there, faint but persistent, like it was seeping through the walls. And then she heard it, the slow, deliberate creak of the organ's handle right outside her window. Emily froze. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor. There was no way anyone could be outside her window. But the music grew louder, filling the room, drowning out her thoughts. She stumbled to the window, heart pounding, and yanked the curtain aside. The organ grinder was there, perched on the fire escape, his pale face illuminated by the yellow glow of the streetlight. His hands worked the organ handle, the same slow, methodical rhythm, and his eyes locked onto hers. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. He didn't answer. He just smiled, a cold, empty smile, and kept playing. The next morning, Emily's neighbours found her apartment empty. The door was locked from the inside, the lights still on. The only sign she'd ever been there was a scarf lying on the floor and the faint, haunting melody of an organ drifting through the air.